Are Mythic Plus only players and non-Mythic Raiders getting shafted in the War Within? That's the question we're trying to answer in this video, where we will be going through the gear reward system from the beginning of Dragonflight through the different seasons of Dragonflight and now into the first season of the War Within, and what is changing. We're getting the help of the based and season-pilled Tamanaotsu, aka Tama, aka Amzeus, who is at this point our new season savior, constantly coming up with these mega guides about a new season and a new expansion and what to look for. And of course, I'm leaving behind the link for the new The War Within guide in the description. Now, we have to go back though, where everything started in Dragonflight with the Vault of the Incarnates Season 1. This one, in case you have forgotten, did not have the Crest system, no upgrades, everything was very boring and stale. You had max Mythic Plus item level capping at 405, the early Mythic Raid bosses were 10 item levels above, and then the latter part of the high Mythic Raiding bosses were about 16 item levels higher. So the average was about 13 item level gap from Mythic Plus to the Raid. You also had the Great Vault though, from Mythic Plus, which could go upwards of late Mythic Raid boss level, and also the crafted items being 418, which were just 3 item levels weaker than Korog and Datia kind of item level. Now, Blizzard, though, changes everything with M+BROS. Now, admittedly, this was a mistake. Admittedly, they just super powered our ability to get gear. I don't know if you remember me making multiple videos about this, how in a pretty simple and laid-back guide on how to upgrade your gear in week 1 and then week 2, and then by the end of week 3 you would be able to find yourself at 443 item level in season 2. And this, by the way, was without any Mythic Raid boss killing. This was purely from Heroic Raid or Mythic Plus spam and crafted items. So 443 item level average in a season where most of your gear will be 444, you were basically capping in item level in 3 weeks. That's how sped up M+BROS was. Not much was changing for Mythic Plus in terms of base reward. What changed was the hero track. Because now your Mythic gear, which was much like M+BROS, some 13-ish average item levels lower than Mythic Raid bosses, now had a hero track, which could be upgraded all the way up to 441. So now suddenly spamming Mythic Plus gave you 441 gear, and the only limitation, the only cap you had every week was how many crests do you have to upgrade. But eventually you were able to get all of your Mythic Plus gear up very close to Mythic Raid item level. The crafted gear was also still very powerful. It was nerfed by 3 item levels, but still quite high in power, so players in a combination of Mythic Plus gear plus Great Vault gear plus crafted items were able to get super good and high item level even as a Mythic Plus only player. Now Blizzard reined this back a little in M+BROS. They were like, okay, problem number 1, we're not giving an upgrade track for the early Mythic bosses. The early Mythic bosses are becoming useless because they literally have the same item level of Mythic Plus gear. Yeah, I know, they are early Mythic bosses, they are supposed to be easy, but this is spammable every day, every week. These guys are not. So Blizzard in M+BROS added the Aspect Crest with the Myth track also working for the early bosses of the raid, so that players had still more incentive of killing the earlier bosses of M+BROS. But the Mythic Plus advantage was still there. You still had the cap of Mythic Plus gear starting at Hero 2 out of 6, and you could be able to upgrade your Mythic Plus gear all the way up to 483, which was only 3 to 6 item levels below your decked out Mythic Raider. This was a long day away from the early days of Vault of the Incarnates, where a top Mythic Plus geared player was still some 15 to 16 item levels below a Raider. Now, in M+BROS, Mythic Plus players were only within 3 to 6 item levels of players who were Mythic Raiding. Now, the only advantage of the Raiders was being able to get geared up slightly faster. Why? Because Raiders were getting gear here So they needed to spend their crests for a couple upgrades, level 2-3 upgrade levels, whereas Mythic Plus players had to spend some 5 upgrade track levels worth of crests. So of course it would take them longer to get to a similar item level. But within a few weeks, the difference between Mythic Plus players and Raiders would normalize. Now, what is changing in the War Within? Because initially things seem quite similar. Number one, you still have the 9-ish item level gap from the early to the later bosses of the raid, much like we had here, 480, 489, even here, 441, 450, you know, it's a similar gap. Same when it comes to Mythic Plus, you drop the loot at Hero 2 at 613, you can upgrade it all the way up to Hero 6, which is 626. Most of the Mythic bosses are around this area, so it's about 3 to 6 item levels below Mythic Plus gear. So it seems to be about the same. Now there is a problem. What is not mentioned here fully is that we now have 2 more myth tracks. At the very least, for the moment. Maybe this is an oversight from Blizzard, but for now, there are actually 6 myth tracks. So there is a 636 here and a 639 with 2 more myth tracks. Now, what is this causing is quite big. So thing number one, of course, if you only get gear from Mythic Plus, you are hero track blocked. So you stop here and you can't go further the myth track level. Problem number two, the crafted gear gets weaker. If you add 2 more upgrade tracks to the Mythic Raiding gear, this one becomes weaker, and this was one of the good ways for Mythic Plus only players and non-Mythic Raiders to get high item level gear through crafting. But the much bigger problem, of course, is the crest cost. Because even in previous expansions and seasons, you could still match up, as we mentioned, in a few weeks or so, also thanks to the help of the Great Vault from Mythic Plus, to similar level of a Mythic Raid, right? You could be able to get some very high item level Mythic Plus pieces. What is changing though is that early on, your high item level piece from the Great Vault from Mythic Plus was a Myth 3 out of 4 item, meaning you loot this from the vault, you upgrade it once, so that's what, like 15 crests or so, and you had your max item level piece. Then comes a Mirja Seal, and now the Great Vault item from Mythic Plus is a Myth 2 out of 4. So now you need 2 upgrades, 2 points, 30 crests to get to your max item level from a Mythic Plus Great Vault. In the War Within, you now have a Myth 1 out of 6 upgrade track levels from a Mythic Plus Great Vault, which means you need 5 upgrade track, so 15, 30, 45, 60, 75 crests to get your full item level, item from the Great Vault, if you were a Mythic Plus player. So basically we went from the 15 crests needed from a Barus to the 75 crests needed from the War Within. It's a significant increase, a 4-time jump, from a 3 out of 4 of a Barus now down to a 1 out of 6 of the War Within expansion. Now this is of course where it becomes a disadvantage for Mythic Plus players, and why we have the question for today if the Mythic Plus players are getting shafted. Because Mythic Raiders do get to have a discount, do get to skip some of these upgrade levels because the raid bosses drop higher item level gear. So while the Mythic Plus players would already have to limit himself only to once a week, 1 Great Vault a week of myth track gear, the Mythic Raider will have more chances than once a week, of course, and then on top of having more chances, these items will be dropping right here. Meaning that for many items, they will not need 5 upgrade levels like a Great Vault item from Mythic Plus. They will be able to only need 4 or 3 or 2 upgrade levels from the myth track gear they are looting from the raid. So the problem highlighted in the system would be the extra expenditure for upgrade levels of crests for Mythic Plus players compared to Raiders, which is larger than in previous seasons. Because even in previous seasons, like a Mirja Seal, if you were doing only Mythic Plus, you were getting a 483 item, 2 upgrade levels, and you would be done from the Great Vault. And in here, it was only 1 upgrade level. Now it is a much larger gap. it would be a significant chunk of extra crests required for Mythic Plus players to round up their gear at a similar item level that they had in the 2 previous seasons. Similar in the sense of compared to Mythic Raid level gear. And of course, but this is only slightly, it's also a nerf for Mythic Plus players because the crafted gear would become weaker. Obviously, if you stretch the mid-track gear to be stronger, it means, again, raiding gear gotten from a mid-track can be upgraded further than a crafted gear. So a Mythic Plus player who has gotten, for example, their 2 embellishments already might be starting to think about rounding up their gear with more crafted gear, because the Great Vault would be below the crafted gear by 6 item levels, so crafting a piece of gear would be better for you. But that would still be a gap from Mythic Raiding gear with 6 mid-track levels, which would now make the crafted gear 10 item levels lower than the best of the raiding gear, which is not what we had in M+BROS, where 489 was the best gear and the crafted gear was 486, which was only 3 item levels below. You then had the 447 in M+BROS with 450 being the best gear, so this would also make the crafted gear weaker in the War Within. And then, of course, for last but not least, you would have the problem of the actual power. Because, of course, if a Mythic Plus player can now only get decent item level gear, no longer from upgrading this from Mythic Plus end of dungeon chests, but rather from the vault, because it becomes mid-track and can upgrade it, then this would only be once a week, right? So the speed with which raiders will be able to get multiple mid-track gear pieces and be able to upgrade them all the way up to 639 will be much faster than what a Mythic Plus player can get. True, it won't matter that much at the beginning. Most guilds will be stuck on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bosses. They will be, maybe if you're lucky, getting 1 item per week, even less if you're, for example, a healer. So actually, in the first few weeks, maybe a Mythic Plus player might be getting better gear than a raider. But later on, past the first month or so, when more and more bosses are on farm, fewer and fewer items are going to be contested by players, Mythic raiding gear will be able to be afforded and looted way more often than the lock that you have as a Mythic Plus player, which is 1 mid-track gear item per week. So even if you were to get one of these juicy mid-track items stacking up to 6 levels, it will still be at a lower rate than what Mythic Raiders are getting, meaning that you will be able to get a larger gap between the item level of a Mythic Plus player and the item level of a Raider, which was not a thing in M+BROS or in M+BROS, as mentioned, because the hero track was much closer to the mid-track, meaning Mythic Plus player were able to stay closer to the Mythic Raiders, and because the Great Vault items from the Mythic Plus rewards were higher item level, required less aspect crests to upgrade, and the crafted gear was also stronger. So all these things combined kept you pretty close with the item level of a Mythic Raider, but now it's gonna be a wider gap. Now it's gonna be more likely to see Mythic Raiders at 5, 8, 10 more item levels than someone who is not Mythic Raiding. So that was the question for today related to the value of the Mythic Plus gear. Now, to be clear, even if we actually don't have 6 out of 6 mid-tracks and this was just a collective hallucination, it's still a slight nerf, not nearly as big, sure, but still a slight nerf for Mythic Plus players, because you still get, and this is confirmed, the Great Vault Mythic Plus gear at 1 out of 4 mid-track. So you still need 3 upgrade levels. So you went from 1 upgrade level needed in Vault of the Incarnates to requiring 2 upgrade levels from the Great Vault to get the max item level item, and now in the War Within you will need 3. Meanwhile, a Mythic Raider will not. Will get most of the items in this range, so saving more quests than they would if they were only playing Mythic Plus. But it's not obviously as bad as if you had 2 extra tracks in your mid-track when it comes to upgrading your gear. That is the problem we are highlighting today. If this system is going live as it is, it will just make it much slower for Mythic Plus players to catch up with the item level of Mythic players, because they will have to wait once a week for the Great Vault item and then have to spend even more crests to upgrade that item, whereas Mythic Raiders will have more options to get freebie discounts on their mid-track simply because the item level of the raid drops is just higher by default. So we will see, of course, how this develops, but for now, whether or not it stops at 4 out of 4 or even 6 out of 6, it is still a nerf to the speed at which Mythic Plus players can upgrade their gear to match the item level of Mythic Raiders. It's just a matter of how big of a nerf it is. So this was our point for today, I guess maybe our worry for today. We will see how this gets detailed and clarified by Blizzard in the near future. So for now, this is just a worry, not a certainty. But for today, on this Wednesday and on the welcoming of the pre-patch of the War Within, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for everyone who has watched the video, as well as the free ways to support the channel, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I didn't even notice it because I was busy speaking, but looking behind me, I see clouds. That's nice.